Καλησπέρα.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. It's very good to see you in this first month of 2020 with a subject which will be something that concerns us all, and it is a great opportunity for us to think about it. And I will try to listen more about these things. The questions are, in fact, inexhaustible with respect to climate change. So I will try to actually hear things from our guests, everything that they have to share with us today. And of course, we will try to also unfold all the aspects related to this matter and they affect all sectors that have to do with the course of the climate. And I think it's, in fact, the fate of all of us that's at stake here. So we are the Dialogues of Stavros Foundation, and we're here in the Museum of Natural History of Goulandris, and it is in fact not by chance that we have chosen to be here, as is the case in all the dialogues of all the months, and this is true for all of you. So we'd like to welcome all of you who are here, whether physically present or through live streaming, and we're interested in listening to all of you, whether you're here or whether you are listening through the internet, and all of you who are actually seeing what's happening here today through the social media. And you will be able to find the accounts of Dialogue, SNF Dialogues, in Instagram, Facebook, and there also we receive your comments and questions. And you see the accounts, and you also see the hashtags. Freedom of speech, because that is what we're trying to achieve each month through this initiative, and hashtag SNF Dialogues. So you can actually follow us through the site snf.org/live and /dialogues. If you want to send your queries and questions through the internet. I'd like to welcome all of you who are here with us today and who have responded to this invitation in order to broach this difficult subject, even though we actually seem to speak about it lightly in our day-to-day life. And I am now expressing the view and impressions of a citizen. This is, in fact, something that touches and really troubles the society that is better educated. And you will tell us whether this is the truth or a myth, and what can be done in order to improve the state of affairs. But I think that we can say that we hear a lot of things on many levels. We hear politicians talk about it. We hear very famous people talk about this in very intense tones, but we also see a younger generation which has actually entered very dynamically in an audience which is better informed. I think it is the younger generation which is better informed than ourselves. I think we are slightly behind. We're not as well informed. But let's see what are the signs of the time and what is happening and how we have to look closely at the very many gaps that we have. Let us start now from the ladies here with us, Vivi Kouduri, who is a professor of School of Economics, and she is the chair of the European area. Thank you very much. And Eleni Andreadis, author, educator and sustainability specialist, and founder of the non-profit organization Planet Agents. Welcome, Mrs. Andreadi. We'd like to also thank you. Mr. Yerashopoulos is with us. He is the director of the National Observatory, and we must say that in certain discussions we have certain figures, not simply to impress, but in order to show a direction and to be able to help us understand through you how things can be best interpreted. And Mr. Iosif Voititzayas, welcome also. He's an associate professor of environmental politics and policy at the Department of Environment at the University of Eugene, and he will help us see how we use words. And I say it simply, but not simplistically, because we hear climate change being spoken about by people next to us from the moment that we leave our home. And, they'll tell us, okay, it's blowing hot and cold. The climate change is going to drive us crazy. This was not the climate in Greece. Up to leaders of nations, whether they're in the run-up to elections or not, whether they're in international negotiations or not, we see that this actually occupies a predominant space in our discourse. And from there on, we have political axes and directions. But we have to see what is happening in terms of communication also, whether that is, in fact, a message that is put across or it's used in order to put across other messages. And we have also representatives of the WWF and Greenpeace. And we will have the possibility to speak with Mr. Grigoriou, who is, in fact, climate and energy campaigner of Greenpeace in Greece, and Mr. Dimitris Karavelas, who is the director of WWF Greece. So very shortly, we will listen to you because you have, in fact, a lot of experience about what is happening in Greece, and we know that you have taken on many actions in the same sector with the same concerns and have been very active. And of course, we have with us everybody from the Goulandris Natural History Museum, and this is where we are located today for this discussion. And very shortly, we'll be able to see the museum, and we have the president of the Goulandris Natural History Museum, and we see how this enters into the debate as the Natural History Museum. What do you see, and what are the ages that come and visit the museum, and what is the reason for it, and how in this great and multi-level discourse can we enter? So I think we can launch this discussion with a question that has to do with this term, climate change. And I'd like to start, Mr. Yassoglos, from you. So, Mr. Yassoglos, before we saw what climate change is, before we actually start with the causes, how it came about. Perhaps for certain of you, there might be a question. How from the global warming we went to climate change, and certain people are trying to actually say that it's either this or the other. This is, in fact, a crisis. So it's a climate emergency. Could you actually tell us what is the term that should be used?
First of all, let me tell you about the use of the words. We started off with global warming in order to define how man with his interventions has increased the temperature on the planet. And then we had the discussion that these are cycles which repeat themselves, climate changes, and then we used the term climate change to talk about natural, about man-made interventions and the impact thereof. Even though we think that in the latest years we also have climate crisis, there we have another dimension. The question being, do we have time to change what is now happening to us, what is upon us? These are the three terms. All three terms are valid. They have their history, and there are specific reasons for which they were introduced into our vocabulary. So, Mrs. Koundouri, knowing that you have studied economics, so could you tell us your view on this, your take on this? I will agree, I will fully agree with the previous speaker. I would like to explain why it's important for us to understand what is happening and why we should perceive it as a crisis. It's a crisis for human beings. So the climate is changing, the conditions on the planet are changing, But what is defining, what is decisive, is that we, as a species, but also the biodiversity surrounding us, will not be able to survive on this planet. This planet may survive, even though there may be more extreme weather and meteorological conditions. So the crisis has to do with our ability to survive on the planet Earth. So what is happening to us, and this is something we need to respond to, is not an attempt to save something other than us, to save nature and to save the planet. So we are now called upon to save our possibility to exist on this earth. And this is why we call it a crisis. And why is it a crisis for man? Because it appears that even though we have the technology and the money, the financial resources to avert or halt, if you like, the +3, +4 degrees Celsius. Talking about a rise in temperature here. So if we don't stop this from happening in the next few years, then the impact will be devastating and extremely negative for millions of people. So this is a crisis. It's a crisis because we have very little time. The clock is ticking. We really have very little time to change the course of events. And this change, well, we've never been called upon to do this as human beings in such a short space of time. So we have a very limited time, and the change we must make is huge in order for us to be able to survive. Another question that comes to mind after hearing what you said is why we ended up in this dire state. And why is it now that we understand that we have to listen to what's happening and to do something because we are out of time? Why did it take us so long to react? Well, the scientists have been saying this for years, for many years. So since 1998. So let me talk about our recent history. Let me go further back in time, because this history is something that goes way back, and there's been heated debate amongst the scientific community since the 1970s. And the data comes from even, it's long ago. But since 1998, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they draw up the reports and measure the impact on climate change. So everything's been measured since 1998. And now we're in the year 2020, and we wonder whether China, India, and the US and Trump will actually say yes so that we can all deal with it jointly as humanity. This is a very difficult endeavor. Why? Because we're talking about a global good that needs to be protected. And we all know that when something belongs to many people, but does not have, there are no explicit property rights, meaning nobody really owns them, well, the management then is extremely difficult. And up until the moment that the impact becomes understood by the layman, then it's too late. We've gone past the tipping point. Now, let me go back to history, but of course, very briefly. But we need to learn more about what happened in the past when scientifically the two communities start sounding the alarm regarding the climate and how climate changes. Mrs. Andriadi and Mr. Kifissia, I'd like to hear from you too. Mrs. Andriadi, I'd like to add to what Phoebe said. And I'd say that it took us a long time to realize that this is something that is of concern to us, that affects us. And one, if you like, failure of the environmental movement and the scientific community is that people realized that this is something that had to do with polar bears, that it affected polar bears that are so far away from us. And one of the reasons why there's awareness now is that we've seen this 1 degree Celsius, meaning we saw that what we were told by a scientist is now a fact of life. that it's a reality, but it also has to do with the use of the term. Let me go back to that. Many believe, at least, we're talking now about the negotiations in the IPPC, that climate change was adopted as a mild, a softer term, because global warming sounds scary, more frightening, and they thought that the term climate change was preferable. But scientifically, it covers more things, not just temperature rise. And there are many matters to be dealt with. And I would like to say something else as well. We have 10 months, if you believe that at the end of the year, we will have the 26th conference on climate, and their decisions need to be taken at that summit, because if the decisions are not taken then, the member states will not be able to reduce by 50% their emissions by 2030, which is a requirement in order for us to stay at 1.5 degrees, and I'm talking about climate change. So we're talking about 10 months' time, and this is the, if you like, success story of Greta and the young generation. They say it's a moral issue. It's a matter of justice. It's not something that we should think of something being far away from us. This is something that has to do with human beings. Let me get back to what you mentioned. Mr. Botetsayas, you have the floor. Why are we talking about climate crisis? Why crisis? This is, so climate crisis is another parameter of environmental crisis. And it took us long to understand that. Then in the 1950s, we understood for the first time, for example, that what we'd been brought up to believe, and this is something that came from the scientific community too, because we keep talking about scientists as if they can find all the solutions, but they also created the problem to a certain extent. And this is something we need to admit and discuss at a certain point in time. Why do you say this? Let's remember what the doctors said. For example, the doctors might have said that smoking isn't that bad, and then there were scientists that had been paid by the oil industry, and they would say that there was no problem regarding hydrocarbons and emissions, and there were certain other researchers who denied that the ozone layer had been depleted, and so on and so forth. So let's not think of the scientific community as a cure-all, that they'll find solutions to all our problems. We understood, but this was rather late, that there are certain solutions to which we can't offer technological solutions. There can't be small fixes. There is a crisis because we understood that we've become very strong, we've become very big in relation to what the planet can take. Can the planet withstand what we want, the demands of our society and the demands regarding consumption by human beings? And we are to blame for the dire situation. It's not that these climate changes happen by themselves. We know that there's change in climate, and this happens over time, but this is happening now very fast. We know what's behind it. We know how to change it. The matter is that we need to decide it. Now, another daily issue of discussion, and this is something that we heard in the recent past. It was prevalent, and you have the following situation, and I'm talking about recycling, for example, another issue. We saw that recycling was a message. There were many commercials about it, many advertisements, and then we saw this whole thing about recycling, and there were researchers and experts in different panels and discussions on the matter. So there were interviews, articles on recycling, and so on and so forth. Then we saw that there were schools as well where they discussed recycling. And then we'll talk about the younger generation later. So we'll do that at a later stage. But we saw a couple of years later, 18-year-olds, they knew the whole cycle of recycling and so on and so forth. And on the contrary, we saw adult groups, 25, 30, 35, 40 years of age, and they tried to adopt the idea of recycling, but they ended up rejecting it. Why? Because there was this mistrust, if you like, meaning, okay, let me recycle, and then what? I put everything in the right bin if we have a recycling bin by the municipality. But what happens afterwards with all this waste that is going to be recycled, the recyclable waste? What happens to it? So should I recycle, or are they actually pulling a trick on me? So this is something that many people have wondered. Then we can move on to something more specific after answering this question.
Well, this is a major issue, and recycling is something that has been talked about a lot because it is something that's easy to do because we don't need to change a lot what we're doing. So it doesn't need to have, in fact, a big change that we might have a company that still packages things in plastic, and it's up to the consumer. And the reason why it's been financed greatly by companies in terms of education is that it's convenient in many ways. So I think it's important to talk about a reduction in consumption, and young people already see it. They are rejecting consumerism. And reuse is important, etc. Now, why don't we recycle? Unfortunately, mistrust, especially in Greece, is very widespread. It has to do with awareness raising, and it also has to do with the mistrust, which is actually justified oftentimes. But it's also put forth as an excuse. And we see young people, at least when it comes to education, convincing their parents to do it, even if they don't know whether it will be then recycled properly or not. And we see that even recycled plastic doesn't have an outlet to go to. So there are many facets to the issue of recycling, but education has to be backed up with the general culture of a country, and there we have gaps. So, if you permit me, I'd like to say that I agree completely, and that's very important in terms of climate change. Now, what was just said, recycling was promoted in the US in the 70s in a coordinated fashion by companies that tried to actually put the onus on the consumer, that you're a bad person if you don't recycle. So 50 years had to go by until we actually started talking about what we are doing in terms of plastic. So this is something that's also happening in climate change. So it's a lot easier to simply say it's up to the citizen that must be aware and should buy this, that, or the other, rather than opening a much greater debate about what are the choices that we are giving to the citizens and what are the interests that are being served in order to have these choices. So that was what I wanted to say in order to actually add to what you just said before. Now, I think this is a very important chapter that has just been opened, and that is education. It's very good that when we actually educate the younger people, and we actually start with recycling, but we can also train people when it comes to water and not leaving the taps open for hours. So I think that this is something that should be taught from kindergarten, and it should continue in terms of education in the higher levels of education. So I was pleasantly surprised that in the committee for climate change that I'm participating with Phoebe, I would have expected to see technocratically 2 or 3 things being talked about, but we saw that a change of mindset through education was number 1 in order to improve the future from now. Let us hope that that will be the case. Yes, it's important to have the possibility to explain the result or prospects of any change you want to bring about on a political or other level, whether on a national or local level, or even within the family. You have to explain it to people who understand. That is key. You have to find the way to explain it because it's important for everybody to understand. Yes. So that means that you need education. So, for example, recycling is something important in order to reduce climate change. How many of us know this? Recycling is part of what we call cyclical economy. And, okay, we'll get to that, don't worry. let's not go to the economy yet, but I started of something that has to do with our daily life. But the cyclical economy doesn't have to do with the economy. The circularity of production, it's called circular economy. So recycling is, in fact, part of the productive model, of the circular productive model. And if it is, in fact, implemented, it can reduce the CO2 emissions and the emissions of other greenhouse gases by 45% from heavy industry globally. Well, you will show this to us later because I think it's important to see how the policies actually trickle down to the citizen and how the citizen can then influence through his daily life in what happens overall. So I think this is, in fact, something that's happening in terms of circular economy. We hear this referred to in many sectors, but this is perhaps the most important because it concerns us and the conditions in which we live, and I want to look at this afterwards. Now, as we all saw, at different instances perhaps, in its entirety, others, what happened in Australia. And I'm not referring to this just randomly because we saw here that a destruction unfolded. And this had a duration of months. We saw that this issue was, in fact, in the news. Then it actually stopped being discussed, then coming back truly in a very apparent manner. And then we saw politicians talk about it and international relations being forged, etc. So we want to hear you speak about this. And you can choose to do it from the perspective of your choice. And you can see what actually came out of this destruction. And let me be a bit more specific here. Here we saw tracts of land burning, animals being burnt, and this unspeakable destruction unfolding over months. And we saw people talk about it, we had communication strategy, we had the influence of social media, people starting to speak about it, then stopping, and then everybody talking about it, misinformation, and confusion reigned. And a question begs an answer. Who will tell us what's happening?
So I think that what's happening is obvious to everyone. We are confronted with a situation where very high temperatures coupled with very strong wind make it impossible to manage wildfires. This is what happened in Australia. And that's a terrible picture with a charred kangaroo. But all this had been predicted. It's been said, it's been written, and why haven't measures been taken? Australia, even today, and we were in Madrid a month ago, well, we know that they haven't agreed to reducing GHG greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something they need to do on the basis of the Paris Agreement. So Australia, even to this day, is not a signatory of the Paris Agreement. As we speak, we are faced with a very terrible, devastating phenomenon. We see that the biodiversity of Australia has been decimated. Thousands of human lives have been lost. Property has been lost. People have lost trust in how the state manages the situation. People don't believe in politics anymore. But you still see that they still don't sign the Paris Agreement. For me, this is a political incapacity, if you like. It's political failure, the failure of the politicians. I think it's the political leaders that have failed dismally. It's a lack of political will. No organization, no people, young or old, should need to put pressure to bear so that the politicians of the country finally sign the Paris Agreement, because they need to deal with the situation right away without further ado. Let me just add to what was said. What we see, as Phoebe mentioned, is something that had been predicted. Just this year in the summer in Siberia, we saw fires. We saw that an area the size of Belgium was burnt. We saw fires in the Amazon in the month of August, and a huge area was burned to a char. I think it was the size of Hawaii, Connecticut, New Jersey, and New Hampshire together combined. And today, now in Australia, the area burned was the size of the UK, the United Kingdom. And this happened just in 1 year, in 2019. In 2018, we had the fires in California and Malibu, etc. So this is something we've seen. But we're only talking about fires here. Yes, it's not a coincidence. On the 17th of December was the warmest day ever recorded in Australia, 42 degrees, 40%, Mr. Gerasopoulos can correct me, 40% less rainfall. So we're talking about things that could have been predicted and were predictable. Now, the irony here is that Australia, well, in December, they actually didn't want to help with the agreement. And let me say that the biggest coal exporter worldwide, Australia. And unfortunately, the Australian government and all the politicians are heavily dependent on the coal lobby. And what we see is a miniature of what's happening worldwide. And of course, we have the opposite view. Mr. Gerasopoulos, you can say something on this, if you don't mind. And this is something that's been heard. This voice has been heard. And I don't know what the percentage is. There were some people who said that because the measures were not implemented against the spreading of fires, I'm talking about wildfires, forest fires, and the measures that had been taken in the past, because the measures were not taken, this is why the spread of the fire was uncontrollable. Well, this could be the case, but let us understand the link with climate change and what actually happened in Australia. You saw the order of magnitude. It's the size of Greece. 100,000 square kilometers in Greece is 130,000 square kilometers. It's as if we lost the whole of Greece. Let's look at the map. There was a graph that was published, and here it's like I take one part and I isolate it. I don't really know what I'm reproducing, and people thought that all these fires were in progress. So let's look at it, because here we have misinformation if you don't look at the information in detail. This is a 3D image. It's based on data that record different fires from the 5th of December to the 5th of January, but not happening at the same time, but in total, if you like. They were not all burning at the same time. This is the total burnt area. So different surveys in Canada in similar fires showed that climate change is responsible because it increases twofold or fourfold the possibility of a fire breaking out in an area. That's one thing. And number two, and this is even scarier, it increases sevenfold the strength of the fire, the blaze, how strong the blaze will be, and how much area will finally be burned. burnt. A similar fire in Australia occurred in 2009. We might not have known it. 173 people were burnt to death. So this is something that has happened. There's been a precedent. Climate change is responsible for the fact that instead of seeing this happen every 50, 100 years, it happens more often than that. Is this the answer to those who say that there is no climate change, that there is no climate crisis? Because climate change is not necessarily something negative. So many people deny the climate crisis. They say climate changes, it's normal that it changes because the tools that you researchers have can make forecasts for 30 years and not for a longer period of time. So if we go back to the indications that you've had from the past and the different machines you used for measurement and not what we had, what do you say? This is not true. The scientific community doesn't have this discussion that we don't believe in data, in scientific data. But people in society, at least some people in society, believe that. Could you explain this further? 800,000 years. So we've been able to reproduce concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere for a period of 800 years. So there are cycles. It used to go up to 300 parts per million, and then it went down. It fluctuated. So there were cycles, and these cycles lasted several thousands of years. Now, from 1950 to the present day, starting with this 300, we've now reached 420 ppms. So instead of the cycle going down, we have the spike. We see that the line goes up. This is man-made. It's a man-made intervention, and we don't know how the planet will actually react. But we do know what's happening because now we can have forecasts based on the models that we have. We can see what's going to happen 100 years from now, and all these models show the same thing. They all point to the same in the same direction, and they show that we are at a turning point. It's very important because, of course, if we take measures now, they won't have an effect immediately. 30 to 40 years will be needed for the results of these measures to be visible. Even now, if we maintain stable the CO2 emissions, the temperature of the planet will increase in the coming decades by at least a half a degree. So we need to take immediate measures and measures that will reduce emissions and not only keep them stable.
Now, a few years ago, we had also even deadlier forest fires. And the question is, how many of you will remember the forest fires before 10 years ago, rather, because they did not exist? But the answer is now that we see that the political climate is, in fact, appropriate in order to show these pictures. So it's a matter of communicating climate change. Obviously, there is, in fact, a climate emergency. But, you know, as we started discussing about it, we actually talk about it in all contexts. And, of course, climate change is not to bear the brunt of everything. It's not to actually take the blame for everything. But we have to see how we actually use data, reality, in order to convey a message or a story, how we link the data together in order to narrate something, either as a scientific community or as people who reject climate change or believe it, or as a layman citizen. I'd like to say that no scientist can say that there is no climate change, and climate change means that the phenomena which are dangerous will happen more frequently and will, in fact, be more intense. Let this be clear. Let us not leave here and think that perhaps it is only a few crazy scientists who believe that this is the case. And I think we have to say also that we have actually seen people put certain question marks to these climate change-related issues. Some people say, oh, you know, we don't know how fast this will come about and whether this model or the other model will, in fact, take place or actually come to pass. So in this times of fake news, we see that many things have been heard, and we only need to put a question mark to something in order to create widespread doubt. And we see that this has been the case with smoking. We see that even people who have been affected by smoking will say that it was not to blame. And I think this has also been true for climate change. And I think that we're also confused. When I say this, I mean that in the discussions that we are in fact opening up, we want to hear all sides. So it wasn't very easy to approach people who are from the scientific community. So, I repeat, certain of them are in fact from the scientific community, but express the exact opposite view. Now, if you permit me, I'd like to say that I actually did my master's on this issue of contesting climate change. And this was a more mainstream subject, at least in the US and UK. So there is no scientist who might have been published in a peer-reviewed journal where you have to give your research in a very detailed fashion to be reviewed by other scientists in journals such as Science and Nature, which are reputable, who have in fact produced data that show that climate change is not man-made. So there might be scientists from other sectors. There are certain people who are so-called scientists. They might have a PhD, but who might put forth some arguments contesting it. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it's like using the following example. And you go to a doctor, 99 doctors will tell you that you need surgery, and one will tell you you won't. I think you will go for surgery, won't you? I think that it is, in fact, unanimous in the scientific community that there is climate change. But I think we have to have clarity about what we mean, because to simply insist that everything is certain is, in fact, allowing those who deny the climate change to have more arguments. So I think we need to understand that doubt and uncertainty is part and parcel of science. That's how we actually go about doing science. Well, it's not only a matter of science, but who can actually go about making forecasts with any certainty? From the moment that you leave the present tense and you want to talk about the future, at that moment in time, uncertainty enters into your framework of thought. And even with respect to the past, although we have a lot of knowledge about it and well delineated, and because we haven't discovered or decrypted everything, we must say that we don't have absolute certainty with respect to the present either. And this is even more so with respect to issues that have to do with the far future. And as my dear colleague said here, the ramifications of our interventions today will be felt in 30 and 40 years' time. So, in order to say that, dear politician, make this investment, realize this project in order to mitigate these consequences. Well, when you do that, you're talking in a frame of uncertainty. And also, you have to actually understand that we have uncertainty and deep uncertainty. So when we're talking about simple uncertainty in a short time frame, this means that we know the likelihood of plausible events. When we're talking about deep uncertainty, we are not in a position to actually calculate the likelihood. And now, As regards a lot of issues that have to do with climate change, the scientific community is faced with deep uncertainty, not with respect to whether climate change exists, but what will be the consequences of our interventions today, which we hope to be positive. The matters are very complex and very uncertain indeed. The only thing that is certain is that climate change exists and that we have to reach correct decisions in order to tackle it. Now, I'd like to illustrate my point with an example, and I agree completely. I would like to simplify things because Trump afterwards comes and says, okay, there's deep uncertainty, as you scientists say, and I can actually do something today, and you're not certain what will be the result. Now, we had the following example given by Snyder, who recently died. And he says that we're not completely certain, but we have to do something. So he said, imagine that you go for a routine checkup to your doctor, and he gives you a chest X-ray, and he says, oh, there's a shadow there. And the doctor will say, I don't know what it is. You have two choices. Either we'll run some tests now that costs some amount that's might not give any results, and that will be your money down the drain, or you can come in 6 months' time and we can have a new X-ray, and we'll see whether this shadow grow big, and then we'll know what it is. And then the question that Snyder asked was, what will you do? So depending on the answer that you give here in this example, we have also the response that we should give to climate change on the basis of our knowledge today.
So uncertainty, it's good that we mention it. The scientific community knows about it. So curiosity and uncertainty is what makes the scientific community search and search. But we are more certain than what we are discussing now. Our uncertainty is whether we will have 4.2 or 4.5 global warming degrees temperature. So it's not that we can reduce the temperature. You all seem to be in agreement. I want to say one last thing. Unfortunately, there are not two sides, because you say we look for the other side, but there is no other side here. And this was the problem with the mass media, and this has been the case for a long time now. And the reason why this discussion didn't proceed is they always wanted to hear the other side. But there is no other side. Well, this is not a valid argument. It's not whether there is another side. So we believe in dialogues, and we always need to hear the other side, whoever expresses it, and it is expressed by some. It could be socially, it could be by citizens. There are people who disagree. You can't say that everybody is in agreement. Now, in relation to the mass media, in order for us to be precise here, we enter into a discussion on how climate change was approached as a subject. It's not whether we wanted to hear the two sides. There are other cases where we don't have two sides expressed. So I don't think that's where the problem lies. No, you misunderstood what I wanted to say. That's not what I meant. What I mean, as I said, I've done research on this matter because the mass media wanted to have scientists who would say the opposite, because this is the nature of the mass media. They want to have an argument and a counter-argument. They will have one person saying one thing and another person saying the opposite. But this is not the case here. There is no other side. I'm not talking about uncertainty. I'm talking about whether the climate case is upon us or not. There is no other side, no other voice. There is climate change. There are questions which I can't hear from here. If you want me to ask these questions, please send them to me in writing. So let's not just see what's happening right outside our house. And when we say house, we mean the entire planet. This is something we experienced in a tragic way in Greece. We're talking about the tragic events in Mandra and in Mati. Some months later, we had floods in Mandra, and then we had the terrible fire in Mati. So a lot was mentioned about these two facts. A lot of people mourned loved ones. And we also had the so-called cannibalism of sorts, because I don't think we can use another word to describe it. So the question is whether because we heard the word climate change, the question is whether Mr. Yerasopoulos, you noticed and you recorded other data, new data, and if there were new data, could you tell us what they were? And maybe it's not just describing an extreme weather phenomenon, but that something has changed in actual fact. As you know, in both cases, the National Observatory, with its interventions and measurements, played a leading role, and it tried to handle the situation as best as can be. Let's talk about the floods in Mandra. Now, in Mandra, within 6 hours, the rainfall was over 200 millimeters of rain. In LFCs for the whole year, we only had 370, meaning in 6 hours it was raining, and it rained half of what rainfall you would have, half of the rainfall you would have had in a neighboring area in a whole year. So it's the intensity and the frequency of such intense phenomena will be greater. Is climate change the only culprit here? No, because if we didn't have illegal buildings where riverbeds were being built over, or we know that sometimes we had interventions that were made very late, and maybe there was poor maintenance, so the phenomenon would not have been on such a scale. Now, Mati, what happened those days was terrible. We had very high temperatures, humidity 12%, and heavy drought. Everything was very dry. And we had gales of 100 kilometers per hour. That was the speed. So we see that the conditions were such that led to this fiery inferno. So we see that climate change exacerbates the situation, but humans are to blame. Look at Mati. We didn't have way out. We didn't have any exits. See how Greek society is organized and the Greek services. For example, there are no MOU and cooperation agreements in place. So you have a combination of climate change and human fickleness, if you like, or lack of insight and perspicacity. This is what leads to these terrible results. Would you like to add anything at this point? Let me add the following. This is obviously linked to climate change. Are we talking about intense phenomena, extreme conditions? Unfortunately, this frequency will increase, will rise. And what is of great importance is that we have human interventions in certain areas which play the role of the catalyst. Why? Because they are completely wrong and that they're not in line with EU specifications or international specifications for proper urban planning and for management of water resources and so on and so forth. Protection measures, mitigation measures against fires and so on and so forth. So what happened was going to happen anyway. It was an accident waiting to happen because we had a combination of bad human intervention and the climate change, which exacerbated the phenomenon. Before we move on to the different measures, because you mentioned some quickly, especially in your first opening statement, and I think you already agreed on this, i.e. that the scientific community all these years and from very early on has said that there is a huge problem. And Mr. Potetaya, you talked about also the scientists who are guided or misguided, and we can watch a little video, which is a short video, and it shows a recent part of our history. And then after the video, I want you quickly to tell us when the states start discussing with one another on this phenomenon and why, and at what level. So it's important to find out when and why. You say that politicians don't listen to the scientific community. community. So when do they start listening to the scientific community? And how do they actually use the message portrayed by the scientific community? And we're also talking about the negotiations, the famous negotiations, and sometimes the rest of the community watches, we're just observers, and this is a matter of heated debate in society. And of course, sometimes we ignore certain parts of the puzzle, certain pieces of the puzzle. So let's take a look. So here we see where this video came from. The Kicker Plymouth Foundation also gives feedback. Let me put it simply, gives feedback to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So let us now see how this international map is created and when countries start negotiating and talking and communicating with one another and sharing their concern. And we're talking about global players in this case. As you saw on the video, the 1990s are the turning point. Of course, we started much earlier with Kyoto, and it continues until today. This is a lovely video because it shows what's really happening on the ground, i.e. we all want to do something, but we want our neighbor to do it and not us. But this is one of the main questions that comes to mind. Now, environmental policy or international relations when it comes to the environment, why do we need to cooperate on any subject? So why, if, for example, I'm China, why doesn't the EU cut down greenhouse gas emissions and become carbon neutral? And then I can continue as China to continue to emit greenhouse gases and to pollute. And there's a theory behind this, why countries are reluctant to cooperate with one another and why do certain countries do nothing, like Australia. In a nutshell, because they don't think it's in their own interest. For example, if I believe as a country that the impact on my economy will be much huger than the damage I will suffer because of climate change, I may go out to the international fora and say how sorry I am that the kangaroos were burned to a char and that some islanders in the Pacific will have no place to stay. And then I'll go back to my country and do nothing. I may do or not do anything if I have people that are not interested in the subject. It is obvious that in certain countries which play a leading role when it comes to initiatives on climate change, people react, people shout, and I'm talking about taxpayers and voters. So this is important. Another reason is, for example, something happens to me that's so tragic that forces me to change my behavior. It will be very interesting to see what Australia will do from now on after this terrible destruction. We have an example, for example, nuclear energy. When Chancellor Merkel was first elected in Germany, she tried to reverse the policy of previous German governments on the decommissioning of power plants, nuclear power plants, and removing nuclear energy from the energy mix of Germany. And then we had Fukushima, the nuclear accident. And overnight, practically overnight, Chancellor Merkel changed course. So something very bad may happen and you may change. And finally, you may change because you're under pressure. You're under pressure from other countries. We understand this, we know this because we are in the EU and there are many environmental issues where Greece or another member state would not like to do something but is encouraged to do so or under pressure because it's a member state, their trade relations, financial relations, cultural relations. So pressure by other countries may lead you to one type of behavior or another. I always like to start from 2015 and to talk about recent history and when I enter the amphitheater or when I enter an auditorium for a public lecture, because I believe that recent history is very important. So 2015, 193 countries in September of 2015 in New York co-signed the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, 17 SDGs, 17 clear-cut SDGs. If you see them, half of them are directly linked to the environment and the climate, and the others support any efforts made for sustainable development, which includes the environment and the climate. After this, some months later, Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement for climate change, an effort so that we all try to stop the temperature of going up. We don't want it to go over 2 degrees. And then in 2018, we have the IPCC report that was published, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, and it says 2 degrees global warming, that's too much. 1.5, that's the maximum increase that we can support so that we can safely live on this planet. 2019, September in New York, we announced as a Sustainable Development Solutions Network of the UN, which is the Network for Sustainable Solutions. So we have there the announcement of the 6 paths that will lead to sustainability, meaning every country needs to have the 6 transformation pathways in place, meaning 6 pathways for transition to sustainability. And this has to do with decarbonization. It is also linked to sustainable cities, the proper sustainable management of the earth, of the sea, and of the water resources, the digital revolution for sustainable development, as well as education, equality, health, and prosperity. Every country must create its 6 pathways, explaining how it will carry out this transition. And at any point in time, it will be able to check for each one of these 6 transformation pathways that it will create, whether it is on the right path, whether it is following the right path, so that by 2050 we are actually carbon neutral. We want to have a carbon neutral society. This means plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. It means by 2050 we will have a carbon-free society. So these pathways can be created. It's doable. We have the technology in place and we have the money as well. But what's missing is the following. I fully agree with the previous speaker. When the electorate, when the voters are educated and informed, then they can put pressure to bear on politicians, because politicians listen to the needs expressed by the electorate, by their voters. Now, do we have the luxury to sit and educate people so that they can then exert pressure on political leaders? That's not possible. Of course, we have to invest in it because this will be good for the next generations, for the future generations. But right now, unfortunately, the leverage, the pressure cannot only come from society. It will come from society, but it must also come from elsewhere. And here I'm referring to the way in which science communicates and converses with politicians and how politicians converse with one another. This must be done in such a way so as for us to be able to have this transition, this move to a clean, a carbon neutral society and economy by 2050. Now we have the new Green Deal in Europe, and this is overwhelming. Why am I saying this? I'm not saying that if Europe becomes squeaky clean and carbon neutral, that climate change will be stopped. We know that the EU is not a big emitter, a big polluter. It does not emit huge amounts of CO2. Its contribution is a 9%. We know that China, the US, India are heavy polluters. They emit a lot of CO2. But Europe can pave the way. If it achieves this transition, it can show that it is achievable. You can have this transition to a zero carbon economy and society. You can protect the environment, and at the same time, you will be able to achieve growth and create new jobs, many new jobs, and change your productive and consumption model in order for it to be sustainable. And in this way, you stand to gain a lot. Why? Because you avoid negative consequences, you have a positive impact on the environment and on people's health, and you also have a very good impact on growth.
Next question is something you have put as part of the committee that you've established here in Greece in order to actually be very practical. Because we see that the politicians might listen to the people and to shape their agendas on the basis of trends. Because people, and especially politicians, like to follow the trends. And I think this is all good and well because this is how things stand. But what about ourselves? We say, okay, is that enough? We have information about this and the message is conveyed. But there are organizations that act through the citizen and next to the citizen and together with the citizen. And I think that I have actually got to give you the floor, Mr. Gregorio, and we are going to see throughout these years, as we've seen from the rest of the speakers talking about who listens to who and what exists and what doesn't exist, what we had in the past or what we have now. Let's through the Greenpeace campaigns and through activism, what you have actually seen internationally and also in Greece. Well, thank you, Ms. Buzduko. I'd like to thank the Foundation for its invitation, the excellent debate today, and the Goulandris Natural History Museum for being our host. A lot of questions have been put, and I could speak 3/4 of an hour just commenting on what has been said. I'll start with 3 points in mind. I'll take a step back if you permit. I don't know if it is clear to everyone what is the cause of climate change. CO2 emissions. And this is, in fact, rooted in the global economy and how it runs, and that is fossil fuels. So we see we have natural gas, oil, and carbon. And then it's not only that we actually produce greenhouse gases by burning these fossil fuel. At the same time, we're also affecting the way that the planet actually absorbs CO2 by depleting the natural ecosystems either through industrial and farming, mainly industrial farming, but also the way that we actually deplete the forests and that we influence the oceans. And I say this not to actually broach the matter of recycling. we have a lot of plastic pollution that has actually come forth, but we see that the climate change has come about mainly through the combustion of fossil fuel. And we see that the panel has said that this is a matter of survival. If we go over 1.5 degrees, and Mr. Yarashopoulos can explain this better, the fear of the scientists is that we will have mechanisms put into place which will bring about further increase of temperature. These are the feedback loops. And this is, in fact, no longer linear. So there is the risk that we will have a continuous increase of the temperature of the planet, and we won't be able to stop it. We don't know if it will go up to 3.5 or 4. We're losing control, and it's very important in the years to come. In the next 10 months, I think a member of the panel actually talked about this, that we should bring about the curbing of the greenhouse gas emissions. And we see that in the 40s we need to stop using natural gas, oil, and carbon. And what Mr. Bodazayas was very important. It's not an individual responsibility. The responsibility lies with the central government. So these are the options that are given to us. The fact that the country decides to generate electricity by burning fossil fuel. How much can we do? The fact that we actually have natural gas subsidized. If we want to change the system in our apartments, we will go to natural gas. That's the only option. Now, I'd like to say that negotiations between countries are difficult because of this, because the changes that need to come to pass have to affect specific sectors that are now for decades in the elite of the pyramid. We're talking about heavy industry, fossil fuels, obviously animal farming, and chemical industry. It's not easy, and even in Greece, and we have actually congratulated the government to go to an economy which is fossil-free. It actually promotes the extraction of oil, and this actually goes against and in contradiction with that. But let us look at the Green Deal and how optimistic it is. It is at least the right direction. I think it's very positive indeed that the European Union knows that it needs to set the fossil fuel behind it and to bring about structural changes in the economy in the decades to come in order to stop being part of the problem. Is this sufficient, however? It has an ambitious program which is about 1 trillion euros strong in the next few years. Correct me, Ms. Koudouri, if I'm mistaken. So 1 trillion investments in the next 10 years. This might seem to be a huge amount, but let us compare it to reality. Reality is that the GDP of Europe is 20 trillion per annum, 18 point something. So in the next 10 years, it will have generated 200 trillion worth in GDP. So if we want to actually bring about a change in the economy, we have a very ambitious plan which has given us 0.5% of what we want to change. So I think the Green Deal is a very good direction, but it has to be a lot more ambitious, and it has to actually bring about drastic systemic changes in the way that the economy is functioning. So I think that we have our reservations. And thank you for this first intervention. But can you also answer my question, Mrs. Mosluko? I was a bit hasty to talk about things, and perhaps I forgot. Well, you are very close to the citizen, and I think you know better than the rest of us about what is the knowledge that society has, because you are closer to citizens, and citizens come to you in order to be informed, and they want to participate in your actions, and they can react to something. So I want us to see this through your lens. So what is your view with respect to this? Well, you know that the Greeks are, in fact, a bit of a curious people because I've been working in the issue of climate and energy for 20 years and against fossil fuels. There are times where you believe that it is difficult to speak to the Greek public because Greeks find it difficult to adopt what is new. But I think that there is no other nation that adopts things so fast once they've understood that that is the direction they need to adopt. And I think that the safety belt is such an example. When I was young, nobody wore a safety belt when driving. It was inconceivable. I don't know what happened, but suddenly we see that the whole of the society has understood that we cannot drive without wearing a safety belt. Now, I think it is only the exception to the rule if you see somebody not wearing one. So there's been a huge mind shift in Greeks. So I think that if the central government gives specific and meaningful directions, the Greeks will follow suit and do so fast. I think that the Greeks love the environment and they want to see these changes come about. There is a fear, and I would like to say this. There is a fear of transition and change, whether we're talking about lignite in Macedonia and whether there are, in fact, certain areas where projects have to be done in terms of renewables. But I believe that if we toe the line together and we work upon the solution, as Ms. Goulandris said, there are technical solutions available, and I think we have to start to adopt them on a central level. I think that the Greeks will be able to make leaps and bounds in the right direction. So here I have a whole set of questions that have come, and I would like your answer. But Mrs. Caravella, I would also like to hear your views on behalf of WWF with respect to any of the levels that have been touched upon.
So, good evening. Let me begin with your first question, crisis, climate change or climate crisis. I think that it's a crisis now. So why is it a crisis? First of all, we're experiencing it. We see that it's a crisis. In 2019, we had a very bad year. So we've come to the point now where reality confirms our predictions, and sometimes it even goes beyond our predictions. We saw these images, these pictures from Australia, but also in Brazil and the fires we had in Mati a couple of years ago. And let's not forget the fires in the Peloponnese in 2007 with the mega fires. So this is a situation where the predictions of scientists, what people had been saying for many years, have become a reality. So this is one thing. Secondly, it's a crisis, and I think many have already said it. We also have the element of time that we have to take into account. We're running out of time. Time is running out, and what we should have done years ago, we now have to do right away, immediately. And the third characteristic about this crisis is it is a crisis because now is the time for change. We know that it's a harbinger of the need for change. So let's bear this in mind. And I think that you asked us a question, what do we see and what do we ascertain by doing what we've been doing for so many years? I think in Greece and in the entire world, people are living this new reality. It's not that you need to convince somebody in Australia about climate crisis. They've experienced it firsthand. And Yosif, you actually put a question which I find to be very pertinent. What's going to happen in Australia from now on? So we're entering an interesting phase where political inertia and lack of action on climate change issues will actually lead to a huge political cost. Remember the Prime Minister who visited these areas where there had been huge ravaging fires and people were swearing at him because he had been supported by the coal lobby and he kept denying climate change. And this is why he went to COP and to Paris and said there was no climate change. So people are starting to experience this firsthand and they demand for new policies. Greta and her gang were the first to make a change. They were out there shouting for change. So people are demanding change. You touched upon it, and I think Mrs. Andreadi mentioned this earlier as well. You said that there is a new polarization polarization is the new trend. So there is a polarization, if you like, at personal level, or it's got to do with one's personality. They talked about Greta Thunberg's personality, her education, whether she goes to school, whether she's homeschooled. They started talking about her parents and how she's been raised. So we've seen other parents judging others and saying that they don't know whether Greta is a good role model. And we also have criticism on the part of political leaders who talk about her with contempt, saying that she's just a youngster. So what do we actually encounter in this case? We saw her when she was in Davos. The media looked at what she was wearing and how she stood out. I read an article. She was dressed in pink and she stood out amongst the gray hair and black suits. And Greta made a statement about Trump, and then Trump said, I want to meet her. So what are we dealing with? Are we looking at Greta or at the message she's trying to convey? And of course, those of you who work in the center of Athens, in downtown Athens, you'll see that every 10 days there is a procession. There are schools that are protesting because they want us to do something about climate change. And in Syntagma Square, there were various events on climate change. So this is a recent phenomenon. So what has dominated in this case? Is it Greta or her message? I don't care what she wears, and I don't care how she says what she says. But I know that this girl set off alone, and within a few months, many people from all over the world are standing next to her. They're with her. They've joined forces with her. This is something we all need to recognize. It's time for us to rise up. It's time for us to wake up. And youth has an important role to play in this awakening. So I agree with Greta and all people who come out and fight and demand things and demand change. So you talked about people. People are worried. They are aware of what's happening. But what we haven't been able to do, even in Greece, is for us to realize the connection of these things amongst themselves. Takis talked about fossil fuel. We see things like Mati, the fire in Mati, the floods in Mandra, but we still haven't made this connection. We still haven't realized that this will continue if we continue burning fossil fuel, if we generate power from fossil fuel, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to make this connection. It's got to do with how we address climate change. That's one thing I wanted to say. And the second thing I wanted to say is that for us Greeks, and I disagree slightly with Taki, my colleague, I think that we Greeks are not suspicious, but we want to see things being implemented in practice. And what Greece needs right now is positive examples. We need to have positive examples, things that are doable, workable, but things that we need to have results in record time. So these are things that need to go mainstream. But we must all look forward. We must all move forward in the same direction. That being forward, we can't actually move away from coal, lignite that is, and talk about hydrocarbons to generate power. We can't give subsidies, heat subsidies, instead of giving subsidies for insulation. So we all have to move in the same direction. And we have some positive examples. We were lucky enough to work with many on an initiative on the island of Tilos so that Tilos could become the first green island. This took some time, but it's a success story for Tilos and the local community. But you had a municipality that believed in going green. So this has to happen all over Greece if we want to get good results. So let me now put the questions asked by the audience and by others as well. So the first question has to do with counter arguments. I think this has already been answered, whether there's another side and whether there's the opposite side and climate change. I think you've already discussed this. And then there's another friend now regarding renewables, particularly we're talking about wind farms. We keep reading articles which contest the sustainability of wind turbines and whether they are environmentally friendly and their overall efficacy as a green solution for the generation of power. So they're saying that in order for these wind turbines to be installed, you have to chop down forests. Secondly, that they are relatively expensive, and if they weren't subsidized, they wouldn't be an economically sustainable solution. And three, that removing them after the end of the life cycle is very costly and very bad for the environment. So what do we say to these arguments? What is the scientific truth here? I don't think we can have the pie and eat it too. We need to come to a compromise. And we can say that we will have these solutions, but we will try to also protect the environment and biodiversity when we use such solutions. Now, climate change for Greece. I don't think that anybody doubts that the wind and the sun in Greece can be used to generate electricity. These are renewable sources of energy. Before you move on, there's a second question on the same subject, which says that they fill our mountaintops and islands with wind turbines. Some destroy our nature in the name of climate change and addressing climate change without actually finding a sustainable solution. Can I answer this question? All human interventions have an impact. None of them have zero impact. Unless, for example, we actually live in forests near the springs. Hydrogen. Hydrogen is a good solution too. We'll discuss hydrogen later on as a source of energy. Now, wind energy, sun, geothermal energy. All these forms of energy have a much smaller carbon footprint and environmental footprint than fossil fuel. This is known to everyone. It's very obvious, and I think it's wrong to go down that road. Fossil fuels are the ones whose use for electricity generation have created this greenhouse gas phenomenon. They're the ones that led to climate change because the gases that they emit stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So if we stop using them now, these gases won't disappear from the atmosphere. Now, if wind farms have a negative impact on the environment, yes, they do have some negative consequences, but we always have to carry out a cost-benefit analysis. And here we need to include the financial cost, the environmental cost, and the social cost. And the same, we also have to think of the benefits, not just the cost. In the last 30 years, and I've been all over the world, and I've been carrying out cost-benefit analyses for renewable sources of energy. So in all these years, never, and I'm talking about a span of 50 to 100 years. So in this period, there hasn't been one time when renewables were more costly for society or less beneficial for society, the environment, or the entrepreneur than fossil fuels. So you always have to make this comparison. So I think that the only way is forward. We have to use renewables. And I must admit that what is very important for human beings is the following. When you say to somebody that you have to change course, you also have to provide the technological solution, i.e. the technological solution must be available in order for him to change course. We have the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest situation in France. And why is the case? Macron, and I was in the advisory committee, and he said, I will actually impose a tax on fuel. But do you have electrical cars? Do you have a subsidy for this kind of transportation? If people decide to buy a new car, electrical car, can they actually do so without problem? If you don't have a system in place, then this fuel tax is punitive, and you will have the results that you had with the reaction you had in Paris. Any economist can say this. We're trying to modelize the interaction between man and nature, and we're also trying to show how we can have a more beautiful, sustainable relationship between the two. So we keep saying, we always say that in order for people to change habits, people must understand, first of all, why they must need to change habits, but also they must be given the technological solution to do so, but also the political framework or policy framework. We need to have the right policies in place in order for the solution to be implemented. So here I agree with Greenpeace and WWF that what we need is intervention at the highest level, meaning we need to have the policy framework in place, the policies that will support this transition, and what we also need is know-how. We need provision of know-how to support this transition. I speak with large oil companies, Statoil, Eni, Enel, and so on and so forth. So these companies understand that the future is far away from fossil fuels. So they try to invest on R&D in order to see how they can invest more in renewables and RES, and how they can move away from what they have now, oil and gas, and go to more profitable sources of energy. And what is important is to have the right policies in place which will be supportive so that this transaction can succeed. And I know I'm long-winded. In Greece, you can't need 10 years for the permitting process for renewables. For example, if you want to invest in renewables, you don't need 10 years to get all your permits, whereas elsewhere it's 2 years.
We have a lot of questions, but we have to answer the questions of the people. And I see that certain members of the audience would like to intercede. So I'll give you the floor if it's something short. I just want to add to what was just said. The big major oil companies were interested in renewables before we actually thought about it. And let us not believe that we will actually save the planet with renewables. We need other changes. Which are these? Which are these? Okay, as you ask me, I will tell you. In 20 or 30 or 40 years' time, we will have, in fact, renewables and cars that actually burn less, but we will still have the fossil fuels occurring, but we have the hare and the tortoise. So we will still not have done enough to actually done enough to cover our needs, but we will have not assuaged our greed either. Now, a question that has come before I give the floor to the people who have come here today, and this was my next question, has to do with refugees. Refugees because of the climate change, people and populations that are displaced and who have actually had to leave their home because of climate change. Well, this is something that's already started in the last decades. We see regions that have lack of water, and it is obvious that people will leave them and will actually go elsewhere because of the drought. And we see that it was, in fact, climate change that made us go from one continent to the other. But now we're going to see it more focused and within short periods of time. But I don't think it's something that we hear. Why doesn't it reach our ears? Where does this stop? But it's very difficult to isolate the environmental aspect of the refugee. So an environmental refugee is not somebody who leaves because of the rise of the waters of the oceans, and people can no longer live on the islands in the Pacific. But we see that there is scarcity of water, and water is the number one cause of conflicts. And do we have now a refugee because of the war, or because somebody who actually is trying to escape the conflict which was caused because of environmental reasons? And we see land erosion also, people who are starving to death. And we have civil wars because of non-access to food. Is this, in fact, a refugee because of a civil war, or is it an environmental refugee? And I think that we have not actually defined this. And a lot of people who have come here to our islands and our borders are not simply refugees because of violence and war, but because of environmental reasons. I like the examples. A very simple example, which you might not understand. Tomorrow, a climate refugee might well be the ski instructor, because we will no longer have, in fact, snow in Greece. They'll have to go to Sweden. But that's not something that we really grasp. Okay. I'm turning to the members of the audience now. I thought that we'd already handed out the mic. So, good evening. I would like to clarify that I am in favor of the fight against climate change, and that I recognize that one of the solutions is, in fact, to opt for renewables. So yesterday there was, in fact, a wonderful workshop in the Museum of Acropolis that had to do with climate change, energy and the environment. And they presented various figures. And the technical narrative, as we speak, is that investments have to be expedited in order to be able to have renewables installed as fast as possible. And we need to make the interventions, especially for wind turbines, in protected areas and in the mountain peaks in order to achieve the targets. So 7 gigawatts is, in fact, the objective according for the technical plan that we have of the climate. And what we saw in the Museum for Acropolis is that the permitting, which are advanced level, is 23 gigawatts, which is 3 times the objective. And we see that if we were, in fact, to take away the Natura networks, it would be 16 gigawatts, 2.3 times the objective. And if we were to take away the places that have a great biodiversity, we would still reach 10 gigawatts, which is 1.5% the objective that we set in order to have a better climate. So the question remains, why do we need to actually need to speed up and to have fewer environmental terms? Whilst we should actually do the opposite. We can reach the objectives with the few licenses given. Why don't we make this, in fact, more stringent? Because all of this is done in order to save nature and protect the environment. Whilst, as we speak, now we have the narrative that it doesn't matter if we install wind turbines on the mountains, because in the future this will save the climate and it's a good thing. And is this, in fact, an opening in order to intercede, in order to make industrial investments in areas that was very strictly protected so far? Thank you. Mrs. Koudouri? I haven't understood that there's such a narrative. Obviously. Yes, I was there. So the issue of renewables is very important. This has to do with mitigation. So that means mitigating the greenhouse gases, but also in the programming statements of the ministry with both governments, because we've had good ministers for environments. Mr. Famulus and Mr. Chavitzakis are good, and there's a continuity, and they have an in-depth knowledge of the subject. Obviously, RES is important. Hydrogen is also important. And I want to talk about certain initiatives that we've undertaken in order to finance innovation that has to do with hydrogen, which is of great importance for shipping, in which Greece is a leader, and we have great responsibility in what happens worldwide. Whilst with respect to the rest, we are only responsible for what's happening on a nationwide basis. But we mustn't actually underestimate the importance of the biodiversity of the Natura areas. And the climate change will be addressed by using RES and in other ways. And one of these ways is preserving the natural environment, because the environment itself is, in fact, there to bind carbon, and it is a very important carbon sink. So we see that other procedures that are very important for mitigation is energy efficiency, which pertains mainly to buildings, e-mobility, and the transition to the circular economy. And these are amongst the 9 priorities of the Ministry for Environment. And under no circumstances and under no model do we actually support the downgrading of the natural environment in order to develop the rest to its detriment. So under no circumstances would this be the case. So please use the microphone so that we can hear you. And if we can have shorter answers so we can hear everybody. Perhaps I was long-winded and you didn't understand the question. The question is, as we're able to reach the targets with the existing licensing, why is there such a pressure for having licensing with fewer environmental conditions? The pressure, as I have understood it, has to do with the time for issuing the license. Comment off the mic. The interpreters regret that they can't hear the comment. The license have been given for what purpose? No, there's a lot of licenses that have not yet been issued. They're delayed. And the pressure exists in order to issue the licenses in order to reach the targets set and pledged. This doesn't have to do with undermining the environmental conditions, and that cannot be the case because it's like shooting ourselves in the foot.
Very briefly, until the microphone reaches those who want to ask questions. So please allow me. We're talking about protection of wildlife and biodiversity. This is very important. It must be part of the solution, and unfortunately, it's linked to the fact that we cannot continue. It's not business as usual. We cannot continue to consume the way we do now. And that's where the difficulty lies. We want to continue living the way we do, but it's not possible. So hello, good evening. I heard the question by the gentleman over there, and he answered. He said many things, but I didn't understand why we need to have wind turbines in Natura sites and on mountain tops. I am a supporter of wind farms, don't get me wrong. So the question is, why don't we put them in industrial sites? Why do we need to destroy mountains like Ziria? I come from Ziria, so why destroy the mountains? You're destroying mountain tops and whole mountain ranges. All the mountains where their wind turbines are now destroyed. I think part of the solution comes from what Greenpeace said, that whatever we do, we must reduce the burning of fossil fuels. So renewable sources in Greece, it's 17% of the energy mix. The target is 31%, and we want to go to 35%. So these limits are based on obligations we have vis-a-vis the international community. The Danes also had similar obligations, but they had policies in place, and renewables reached 50 and 70% of the the energy mix, because the higher the target, the higher up you set the bar, the less fossil fuels you will burn, and then you'll have decarbonization. So we will have multiple benefits. Of course, everything that Elena said and what you said also needs to be taken into account. There are also scientific reasons why you pick certain areas. For example, if you place a wind turbine between two mountains, the wind won't actually work the way it does. So it has to go high up. I'm not saying at a mountaintop. I'm saying that you have to find the right mountain in the right place, which is not a Natura site, but there are scientific reasons which tell you where you should place a wind farm. And the same for solar panels, of course. Microphone, please. Quite often we've seen that wind turbines that have been placed on mountaintops were destroyed because the wind was too strong. And also in areas where there is lignite, they still actually do so. And we see, for example, that there's another problem because there's no connection to the grid, and their solar panels have a stable, if you like, voltage. These are technical problems that can be solved, but the principles are that you don't go to a Natura site and you try to have a small impact, as small as possible. Technical problems can be solved. Mr. Grigoriou would like to say something at this point. The two friends have posed significant questions. There is no easy answer. Climate crisis and protection of biodiversity, it's two sides of the same coin. Both must be protected. So we need to see what we need to do, what the target is. We have specific indications. We know how much wind energy and solar energy we need to have in Greece by 2030. And I give you the number by 2050. It's 38 gigawatts. Solar, it's 12 out of the 38. It's a scenario, and this presupposes high efficiency. We know the numbers. Nobody wants to go to pristine areas which are in need of protection and which must be protected at all cost. Why? Because they work as carbon sinks, as you yourself said. So here we have to sit down around the table as society and find solutions. So we exclude Natura sites from siting of wind turbines. And here we need to have a discussion with local society, with the government and the wind companies, the wind energy developers. So why is it that we have lobbying on either side, and why don't they engage in a dialogue? We know that private individuals try to impose their will on local society. Why? Because the licensing process is underway, and then we see local communities with a NIMBY, if you like, syndrome, not in my backyard. And this is very human. They're afraid of this transition. I fully understand. But in Greek society, as I understand, this shouldn't actually, why couldn't there be a fertile dialogue like in Denmark? And I'm saying Denmark because there's a law which encourages such discussion. And what are these discussions? We need to have engagement of civil society from the outset, and they can get dividends. Many of them are energy communities. So we have energy democracy. People participate in electricity generation. This is one of the solutions we need to look at. So where will we put wind turbines? Where will we not have wind turbines? And what will engagement of local communities be? So the question is, we can't have large companies only in charge of wind farms. And let me say that hydrogen is something that oil companies are promoting. It is low efficiency. It's good for some economies, but its widespread use is promoted. But in order for you to have a production of hydrogen, you need double the amount of resources. And look at the study that the Greek government did. So the scenario with the use of hydrogen, we need 75,000 megawatts of renewables and not 38 megawatts. So what we need is a dialogue, and we want to have a win-win situation, good for us and good for the environment. Mr. Grigoriou, can you give the microphone to the other gentleman, and then the gentleman in the first row, and then somebody else right behind you? You have the floor.
Good evening, Lambadakis. I'm a professor at the University of Western Attica. I would like to actually give a note of optimism. We've heard a lot of things which are very serious and which we all feel troubled about, but I think that the policymakers also do so. The EU has understood that there is, in fact, great pollution from farming. Farmers, in their effort to actually produce greater yields, they actually consume more fertilizer than they should, and this gives rise to greenhouse gases, and this means greater energy consumption. So that means for quite a few years now, the EU has tried to undertake an effort to generate knowledge. So how we can actually reduce fertilizer without having smaller yields. And the Goulandris Museum participated in this endeavor that came to completion soon. And that was also the University of Agricultural Science. So it was 12 organizations and 22 scientists participated. The Greek component had to design a robotic system which would, in real time, would assess the plant's needs in fertilizer and at the same time give to each plant the fertilizer required. And this meant that in real time we were able to actually have a 38% gain. So we were able to go to the Valley of Thessaly and to reduce the fertilizer by 38%. Well, it was actually nitrogen that we reduced by 38% because nitrogen is part of fertilizer. So this is an effort undertaken by the European Union in full knowledge of the problem. It's not a matter of grasping the problem now. We know the problem, or at least we know some of the pieces of the puzzle that make up the problem. It's not only the agricultural sector, but there are many other sectors that actually have a share of the blame. So I think that we should know what we're talking about. We actually undertook this project. We took it to the United Nations. We have the know-how and we have the marketing authorization, and we're already talking with a Greek company that produces food and drink, and they will look to use this method in Greek farming, and then we will go on to the EU, and then China and India, because they're the greatest producers of fertilizer worldwide. So there's optimism. So let us not be pessimistic. Yes, we need to keep a cool head. On to you now. And I want to put a question. If you could please put the microphone closer. I wanted to put a question with respect to Greta Thunberg, because you talked about education, and for you in the committee, it is the most important. Are you afraid that such a serious matter, such as this, will be linked to a childish concern or the concern of youth, which in the eyes of the adults or of the politician might appear to be a bit too much? No, not at all. I have 3 daughters. And my team and I have many projects in the North Pole, the Amazon, and the tropical forest. And sometimes I take them with me. The first time that I saw them enthusiastic and really engaged in what I was doing was when they saw the photograph of Greta. They said, "Oh, you met Greta? She's amazing," because she's the person who brought so many people out on the street to protest. The fact that there's a person who can perhaps not have the scientific knowledge or the experience on a political level, who, however, managed to touch people, because in order to be able to rouse the people, you have to touch their emotions. might be an amazing scientist, but we've been speaking out and we've been shouting about it to the politicians, but we've not actually created a stir. But I am truly awed by this girl because she's touched so many people, and I thank her for what she's offered. And I think that anybody who is well-intended and who will invest some time in it will understand how significant this matter is. The crux of the matter is to have an approach which will enable us to change things, where we want to change something and we want people to be engaged in this transition. We should be able to talk about this transition and do so from day one. We need to discuss it with the people, so we need to jointly shape our world and solutions. If you're going to create a PV park or a wind park, you have to talk about the political stakeholders, the local government stakeholders, and the people. And you go about it jointly, because that is then implementable, because it is only then that people understand it and embrace it, and they can have a better life through it. So please. The Greta phenomenon, which has mobilized 6 million people in September, shows the failure of the politicians to take action. And we see that companies went forth. We saw Microsoft actually mobilized. So they said that it's not going to only be carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And I don't consider this a bad thing. And that we have a child that came to the fore. And she's not alone. And she repeats this time and again. So we have, in fact, many such organizations beyond Greta's, but they have been forced to become more adult-like because we are not able to adequately tackle the problem. I would like to talk about something fast. I saw a survey which actually counted the Google search climate change, climate crisis, and how this actually fluctuates over time. So it was quite a few 100,000. They had two peaks. One was in 2006, where the vice president of the US actually published The Inconvenient Truth, and 2 years ago, when Greta actually started this action, and they were of the same height. So the effect is global. And I'm not interested in its origins, but it pleases me because symbolically, as adults, we are, in fact, obliged to towards these children, and they have to put across the message of what they need to do in order to have a better tomorrow. Very fast, I'd like to say that in 2006, Al Gore, and today Greta, what did they manage from 2006 until now? Let us see what we will be able to bring about from Greta and in 10 years' time. And I'm rather pessimistic. So it's good for Greta to rage and for the channels to actually give her coverage. And it was very good for us to go to Sindakamas Square in order to protest about the forest fires in Mati. But what did that actually do? So with respect to renewables, we might have some mitigation, but it's not the only solution. And when the colleague said that we have to be optimistic, I'm very pessimistic, because the EU, as colleague said, is in fact the smallest player when it comes to the global system. So it's as if we're talking about what we will do when we want to protect the small craft and industry from the Chinese products. Because if the EU does not take measures in order to control the products that come in from countries that actually disregard the climate change and our common future, I will consider that we have to continue to be pessimists.
Εδώ νομίζω είναι το μικρόφωνο.
So is the microphone here? Hello? So first of all, let me say that it's not climate change. It is criminal. What do we call it? Come again? Not, we didn't say change, we said something else. Crisis. So it is a criminal type crisis. And it is a capitalist crisis. So when 20 people, or rather 50 people, have half the wealth of the earth, you understand that there are no states, but multinationals, lobbies do as they please. So what we need to know is that in Greece there are people who are struggling for land and freedom. It's not that it's straight. We know that in mainstream media they say nothing about it because they belong to the lobbies and they are supported by these lobbies. The politicians, they say, don't hear, but that's how they elected. That's the system. If the system doesn't change, nothing will change. The only way, and I know we need to put pressure on governments, but the only way is for the system to change. The bad thing about humans is that we accept things as they are, the way they are, and we've forgotten what we can do. We accept democracy as if it's the most perfect system of all. We're used to something that we get ready on a plate. But we have to have immediate democracy, direct democracy. And of course, all these interest groups don't want this at all to happen, but they won't say to you, consume less. The same goes for recycling. They sugarcoat the pill. And so from the moment that the most pristine areas of Greece, like Agrafa, are being destroyed, Agrafa 5 years ago was considered one of the most pristine areas in the world, and you decided to erect wind turbines there. In Chalkidiki, 10 people have been arrested and beaten, so you dare speak, and you are actually sent to hell. So you understand the lobbies do whatever they please. And if we want to be honest, even the area where we are now, and I'm talking about generation of wealth, so that's where the problem lies. We have power, but power corrupts. What do you mean by the area we are here today? Are you talking about the museum? No, I'm talking about all large foundations, the people who have done so. Well, they use the capitalist system to generate money by accumulating wealth. So maybe this is a vicious circle. Do we ever believe that the system will tell us to consume less? It won't do so. They will actually use up even the last drop of oil. So who is part of the system? Tell me the system. What is it made of? We know that there are individuals that have more wealth than entire countries. So you understand who actually governs the world. We know that very few people have most of the wealth in the world. This is the main problem facing humanity today, and this is not going to end. In order for people to regain their lost power, struggles have to be fought. And I'm talking about what happens at a local level. They want to drill for oil, and even in Zagoria, in these protected areas. So all these people who are trying to do this must be sentenced for crimes against humanity. Why are you trying to extract the last drop of oil from the Mediterranean Sea? So what do we need to do? Do we need to we resist in thousands, in millions, and to be beaten and finally be victorious? There is no real communication. We're talking about the way that power is being waged in the whole world. So what you just described is something that some people have in mind to a lesser or greater extent. It's what Mr. Kotsamaya said in the beginning. And but yes, excuse me. This is a public dialogue, and we've been engaging in this public dialogue for 2 years now. And let me say that this initiative dialogues has this main, if you like, objective. What we want is an open discussion to hear all viewpoints without there being any control as to what people will say, who will speak, and so on and so forth. So we have dialogues. These dialogues are not within four walls. This is an initiative where we don't scan who's coming in and who's leaving the room. There is no order, and we don't say who can speak and who not can speak. And let me say that there's also live streaming, and so we go live through social media. So all this has a multiply effect. And our main aim is for us to sit and speak openly about everything. So I think that in relation to the SNF, I'd like to say that the venue is a totally different place. So there is no agenda. There is no written agenda. And I think that this can be seen from the way this discussion is being held. Microphone, please. Microphone. Microphone. No microphone. So we can't hear the speaker. I'm really, really sorry. Now the microphone is on. Thank you. So unfortunately, we have the capitalist model. This leads to a generation of wealth in the hands of the few and not of the many. Generally speaking, this has been recorded. We know that the majority of people out there say this. I am a member of the Initiative of Dialogues, and this is why I wanted to say this. We represent a non-profit organization, and this means that we don't have one person who accumulates all this wealth. Mrs. Kunduri, please be brief. Now, let me talk about this museum. This is a natural history museum. And I'd like to say that it has trained many young pupils and students. It's an educational museum. It's the first private natural history museum. We'll hear Mrs. Voyadzaki say this very quickly. I want all the questions to be heard. So microphone, quickly. Whoever raises their hand, quickly give them the microphone.
Hi, I'm Yanis. I'm 17 years old. I'm a student in the third year of upper high school. Now, whether Greeks are ready for a change, there are 300 children in each school, and because I go to the Fridays for Future, at least 6 children will go, or 6 children at the most. But we see each T-shirt with respect to this will be worn by 20 children. To have a story which is in the favor of the environment, or Australia shows that the young people are interested in the environment and they take care of it. But they see that I'm not interested in recycling, but that would be wrong. It's important to actually take our own shaker and to do things our way. I wanted to put a question. We hear often that the airplanes are, in fact, very polluting. However, the largest low-cost airline in Europe advertises that it has 69 grams per passenger per kilometer, but a large company that actually produces low-emission cars says that it's 140 grams per kilometer for a very low-emitting car. So how is it possible to have such a difference? So is it a question of taking the car or a plane, or is it a matter of reducing the trips that we take? Well, this was, in fact, a way of encapsulating what we've said so far. So thank you for the wonderful discussion. I wanted to say that you said there are other energy sources that will be, in fact, more efficient. Which of these? So, who said that? Is it to Mr. Buditaya, the question? Shall I answer? Yes. I didn't say that there are other better forms of energy than RES. I said that we are framing the question wrongly. We have a problem that says that I have these energy demands, and we're talking about oil, natural gas, or RES. And I'm saying that RES are obviously better than oil or natural gas, but at a certain moment in time, we have to start discussing about why we need this energy so that we have the plasma TV standby in order to heat my our outdoor pool in the winter. Why do I need these things? And that is what I was getting at. And I will answer the young gentleman that 6 out of 30 are out on the streets and protesting is not a negligible amount. So one person can bring about change. So imagine 6. So I think that the history of change has, in fact, started with individuals. But I think in comparison to the plane in our day-to-day life, this is also important. So there are many things that we can do. That was mentioned also by another person before, and that has to do with eating less meat. So please come, Mr. Andrea, in April to the dialogues, and we will talk about this. So I have actually gone to many schools. I've written this in my books. It's something that we don't like to talk about and recognize. And there are a lot of questions that are rather painful. And this is something that we're going to focus on in April. So I am skipping certain questions because we're also receiving certain questions over the internet, but there are many with respect to wind turbines. And we have quite a few questions by Christiana, who's 11 years of age, and says, what can we do so that we can help protect the environment? Athena, who's 9, says, why do adults react so much with Greta? I'm mentioning them because you've sent them, but they have been answered. So I think the next question is, good evening. At a certain moment in time, it was mentioned that when we are, in fact, pursuing the reduction of pollutants, they are, in fact, increasing. And we see that the increasing population actually has contributed to this. And we see that places or regions such as Asia and Africa have, in fact, the increase of population, which is taking place at a very fast pace. Is there a way of keeping the population stable, if not to reduce it? In YouTube, I saw a video which shows that in 2100, Lagos will be one of the most populated cities worldwide. And other African cities will also be in the top 10. And they will even touch 20 million. Well, this has been discussed since 1970s, that the problem of the environment has to do with overpopulation, but it doesn't have to do with the population figure per se. It is what we consume. It's not whether we'll have 150 or 100, is whether it's how much we consume. And we now have an increase in population, and which is following consumer paradigms which are, in fact, in line with Western Europe or the US. So it is not the population per se, but it's the consumption of that person. But I think that the population matter is the sleeping elephant in the discussion. It is a key issue. Comment off the mic. We regret that you cannot be heard. So I think in the middle of the century, we'll have 20 billion. So simply changing consumer model will be sufficient for us to survive. No, but in parallel, we have to find, through technology, also ways and means to help these people. So I have to add to this with a question. Through technology, there are quite a few who actually have examples to give that come through technology against the politicians who don't listen, the scientists that cannot be heard. So everybody is, in fact, to take on their share of the blame because the citizens don't change. And a lot of people put forward these technical solutions in order to justify their arguments. I would like to say, that we have, in fact, quite a few solutions, and we had the pilot project that will, in fact, require quite a few years in order to be universally applied. There are a lot of accelerators that will help us in this direction. Let's look at the problem as such: demand and supply. When it has to do with energy generation and energy demand, so we have to see how we generate energy, but we also have to see how consumers consume energy and their habits. So by reducing generation, you reduce the emissions, but by reducing the need for rest, you're also improving or mitigating emissions. My name is Subu. I am a teacher in the secondary school, and I have run the environmental courses at school. But we have not actually yet looked at what we're doing in terms of environmental education. We didn't have time. This was something that we consider to be key. So we're talking about a change in consumer behavior. This is important, but in order to change, we have to do so. And we see that we are some few romantics who teach this class because it has to be done in our free time. And if we feel like it or up to it, if I have somebody to look after my children when they leave school, in order to spend time at school to teach the pupils this, but nobody recognizes and acknowledges it, and nobody helps me. But I think we have to educate these future politicians, technocrats, and scientists, but we don't do anything about this matter. So, as we have so many changes ahead of us, shouldn't we be talking about education first? If I could shortly respond, because this is a huge matter. We have to see it in parallel. It's one of the SDGs with respect to climate action. So it's also key when it comes to Green Deal. And environmental education in and of itself is not taught somewhere, but it should be taught throughout all courses. It's a multidisciplinary matter that should exist in all courses. As you rightly said, we don't have the resources, and it is up to each teacher to actually do this and do this well. So I think it's something that the Commission's also, or the committee is looking at as a priority, and the Minister also says that it's a priority. The first time that environmental education has become mandatory, or the first country that did so was Italy, and it did it 2 months ago.
Yes. So we're really lagging behind in Greece. Are you putting pressure for this to change? We're trying as much as we can. We have said in the committee that this should be a priority, environmental education. It should be a mandatory subject, but it should be cross-cutting, horizontal in nature. With my eldest son, I read about energy, but there was no comparison of the carbon footprint when it comes to different sources of energy. He's in grade 5. So I think in all grades, we should have this taken into account. We hear you loud and clear, and then we'd like the gentleman to take the microphone. He's been waiting.
When the laws stop working for the common good? And considering how critical the situation is, when is it our moral obligations to start breaking the laws, individually and collectively?
Thank you. If I may, I don't think that the laws are not working towards increasing social welfare. The laws, that is the European directives, for example, are very science-effective, integrated, multidisciplinary basis directives that if they were implemented correctly, you would have the results that you are looking for, both for the environment, for the society, and for the economy. The problem is that implementation is difficult, and the resources for the implementation are even more difficult to find. So I don't think this is a legal problem. I think it's a problem of the difficulty of implementing the relevant laws. It's a difficult problem. Dealing with the environment, it's difficult because it's multidisciplinary, it's science hectic, data hectic. It takes a lot of knowledge and experience to be able to be really responsive to what the directive wants you to implement. So I think we have to be focused, insisting, educating our people, providing technological knowledge, providing technological backup, and really stay on track given the existing laws. The laws are fine.
Don't get angry. Don't get angry. Say it in Greek. All I'm saying that laws are correct. The lady asked in English, and this is why Mrs. Kuduri answered in English. So particularly EU directives, they're very scientific. They're based on science. They're science-based. So the problem is implementing them. So what was the question? Because people are not wearing headsets. So the question is, if the laws are not what they should be and they don't help society, when do we have a moral obligation to violate the law, to break the law, and not to follow the law? And the answer was that in relation to the environment, the EU legislation, and I'm talking about EU directives because this is also national legislation. This is scientifically based, but the implementation thereof is difficult, and it's also costly to implement EU legislation. This is why it takes a while for us to implement it. I'm going to, should I answer in English or in Greek? Whatever you like.
I think the problem is that people,
a lot of people are not wearing headsets, you see. So I think that the problem has to do, well, it's got to do with activism, it's got to do with protests, and a lot of people feel that they have no way out rather than violating the law, breaking the law. We saw COP25, young people came into the room, they occupied it, and people were sending them away, telling them to leave. And this is where the problem lies. A lot of people believe that the laws do not serve society, and that we see that politicians and what's happening in the public sphere does not actually do what it's supposed to do, that we don't have quick reflexes. And I think this is a huge problem. This means that there is a problem on the part of the politicians. They are lacking, sorely lacking. And I think that we need to find a way out. We need to come up with solutions. Thank you. I want to ask a question. Forgive me if I use a lot of words. A lot of us here are from the same side. I think there's nobody on the opposite side. But if we were given the power to solve the problem, I don't think we'd be able to solve it. And let me actually mention what the educator who said that the priority is to educate children. Even if we give our children the best best education in a school, for example, in a classroom. But we live in another society, and we see that there's a specific economy, there's a specific society. So there are other things. So we know that here in all countries, we talk about growth, can be green growth, sustainable growth, but the important thing is growing. We want to have an increase in production, an increase in consumption, even when it comes to electricity. So we see that many of the measures mentioned are good, others are not so good. The question is not which one will solve the problem. Maybe the question is, we have a finite planet. The planet has a specific size. It has finite natural resources, and they can produce specific things. The same goes for energy. So in order for us to move further down, we have to answer this question first. If we don't actually answer, we will only have partial answers, partial solutions. We all keep talking about whether wind energy is a good type of energy or not. Let me be provocative and say that wind turbines are not renewable sources of energy. I'm not going to explain why. I don't have the time. If you figure out how much energy is consumed to produce a wind turbine and then install it, you'll see that it will take years for you to get your money back and before you remove it. So you will have, I don't know if it's a renewable source of energy, if you consider it in that way. Thank you. We didn't hear you? All the wind turbines that are no longer operating are still in the mountains. They are there. They're like ruins. We know that some wind turbines have stopped working. They have a life cycle of 15, 20 years, and we who live near them see them, and they're just standing there. There are scientific methods that look at the footprint. There's a life cycle analysis, and they can tell you for each wind farm, each wind turbine of a different technology, what the footprint was, what the cost of decommissioning is, meaning removing them, and so on and so forth. Now, the fact that they're not being removed doesn't mean that they can't be removed properly and disposed of. We had older technology. It was more demanding. It had a bigger footprint. This is the true. But technology evolves, and there have been great advances. And the footprint of wind turbines is small. And I think it's worth investing in wind turbines just like in the past. Let us give the floor to other people as well, because we slowly have to come to a close. So does the law cover me vis-a-vis the company that installed the wind farm and then left it after it stopped working? So Brent Spar, have you heard of the word Brent Spar or the name Brent Spar? So Brent Spar was an installation to pump oil in the North Sea. So according to the legislation, when it stopped operating, what did the oil companies did? They pulled them out and dumped them in the ocean. And this legislation stopped when people started reacting. So we should stop coming up with excuses and saying that we do things wrong and so on and so forth. We are wrong. It's not that things just happen. So when the life cycle of wind turbines is over, they shouldn't be left standing there. They have to be decommissioned. But the directive has specific requirements when it comes to decommissioning of wind turbines. Microphone, please. We can't hear you.
So that's why we're here as citizens, which was a comment to something that's heard off mic. So Plato said that in a democratic state, it is the citizen who is the police. So if we're not active and engaged, nothing will happen. So please give the microphone. We would like to put two questions. First and foremost, We can use wind and solar energy as key sources of energy which cannot be stored. And second, which are the main parts in the world where most animals are hurt or lose their lives? Well, what a wonderful question, especially the first question, which I was about to respond to anyway. So I don't think that we should actually judge the wind and solar energy projects with respect to what's happened so far. Everything has happened in a fragmented fashion. But we need to have serious infrastructure in order to have what the young lady said. We need to have storage areas. So if we're not able to store this energy produced by solar or wind in specific points in the day or season, and if you don't actually store it, then you won't be able to have energy efficiency. If you don't do it in an organized fashion, then the same system will actually become efficient, and we need to actually have the appropriate resources to change technology or to remove it. It's like we change a computer every 2 or 3 years. It's a matter of maintenance also. And let us say that we have the technology for storing the energy, and the storage installations are in fact increasing. You can see here the chart. Now, we didn't answer the second question with respect to where more animals get hurt. Do you mean in areas where there are wind turbines, or more generally? More generally. Well, where there are many people is the answer. So we were going to actually put this question into the whole discussion, because here we see a project that had been realized, and it showed the species that are under threat of extinction. And you see in the pixels they show, depending with the density, I'm trying to describe it as best I can, which species have already become extinct. And we can understand how fast they're becoming extinct. Unfortunately, the answer is that animals are hurt and injured and die everywhere. Wherever there are animals, there are huge problems. Of course, there are areas that are better protected, and it's important to protect them. I would like to actually underscore the problem with seas. It's something that should concern us all, and climate change is also a root cause for this, because it affects the seas, but it's also overfishing that contributes to it, because we eat too many fish, and there's not a good legislative framework to protect areas. And we see that when certain areas are in fact protected, the fish stock can be regenerated more easily, and this in fact gives a better catch for the fishermen. But so we see that animals can be injured not only on shore but also at sea. So this project is of the WWF, correct? Yes. Now I want us to listen to Mrs. Voyadzaki before we go to the two last questions and interventions, because as I said from the outset, Mrs. Voyadzaki, in our monthly meetings, we're trying to select a venue which is, in fact, related to the subject matter. And how is a natural history museum engaged in all these issues, as it should? Can you hear me? Yes. First and foremost, good evening. Before I actually respond to this question and talk about the museum and what we're doing in terms of climate change, I remembered Angelos Goulandris, who was our founder and first president, and we discussed this in times gone by. He died in 1996, and I'd asked him, because we considered a shift in mindset to be key. We said, what can we do besides information education? What would help the most? And he responded, and that is Angelos and Ms. Niki Goulandris, And he responded that it is very difficult because people are so spoiled and used to doing what they like that it's very difficult to bring about a change. But there's only one thing that will change them, and that is fear. Fear that there will be such extreme phenomena that they will play a very important role in this. And that's unfortunate. But we see that this is where we're going. I'm listening with great respect to what you're saying, but I think that from our entire discussion, what can be derived is that we shouldn't only change because of fear, but also through education. And also another major discussion is the following. We see that climate change has in fact made the younger generation actually stand up to the older generation. We see that it's not certain that people become worse over time. We know that people change and the world is changing. It's not that it actually has become worse. I think we have to listen and be attentive to the changes that are coming. I don't think we should demonize technology, but we should demonize the abuse or misuse of technology. And I think when it comes to education and culture, the museum is key. Yes, that is why we also have an instrumental role. Yes, it is a great honor for you to have chosen the museum for this venue. And we consider it to be a recognition of our effort in order to protect nature and life. And we see that the relationship of our two foundations is, in fact, something that goes back in time, because the Stavros Niarchos Foundation helped in the creation of the GEA institution, and you're amongst our major donors. So our museum was founded by Angelos and Niki Goulandris in 1964. It was, in fact, a time that we had not suspected the ills to come about in the environment. Then in 2001, we had the Center for Environmental Research and Education, with the purpose of actually having research and education as a guide for approaching nature and culture and withstanding the human forces that threaten life, and as a need to remember the warning of Prometheus in going beyond measure. And we see that the museum and the GEA Foundation and the annex in Thessaloniki Ekvi, which is the Hellenic Center for Wetlands, and in Rethymno in the Mostaba Mosque, where we have the Paleontological Museum of Rethymno housed. Well, the museum carries out its efforts in order to curtail the squandering of natural resources, the pollution of environment and waters, the erosion of land, and the climate change. And we see that the effects of which are already felt. Now, I'm going to broach the matter of climate change, which is the subject matter of this event. Well, I think that we need to bring about a change in mind shift from a preschool period. And that's why, espousing this view, the Goulandris Museum has actually taken on this endeavor. And we have worked together with the Bank of Greece, and we're working together with Omega, which is, in fact, the study for climate change. We have put together programs for different age groups of pupils together with the Fuivikuduri. And in March, we're going to start implementing a program together with the program for education, robotics and maths, STEM education. And this program has been created exclusively for our museum, and it pertains to climate change, its effects and solutions through experiments by reinforcing experiential learning. At the same time, we're also updating our tools, and that is the sphere and the dome. And we have workshops for teachers and the broader audience. We inform with respect to the effects of climate change, how to tackle it, and the systematic effort that is made to deny it. And our annex in Thessaloniki, ECVI, has linked its name with the Natura network, and it has undertaken the scientific coordination for mapping the wetlands of Greece in order to create the Natura network. So with programs, both Greek and European, it prepares studies and projects in order to showcase and map the natural wetlands. And it was, in fact, given an award as part of the Natura Awards, the Life Plus Adapt 4 project, in order to adapt the forest management for climate change, was in fact considered one of the best projects in the EU and received distinction. And also the effort to adjust the Attica wetlands to climate change was in fact also enshrined in law that helps protect the wetlands of Attica. Of exceptional importance is the ongoing monitoring of 50 Greek lakes on a monthly basis. Important results and data of this project have been posted on the internet in the website for Biodiversity, which are in fact at ECVI. So in order to preserve life on our planet, we need to redefine the priorities that we have and our values that we have. So that is why we are inspired by life values that have the roots in ancient Greece, and the ethical criteria that have been, in fact, neglected actually played an important role also. The way ahead is not based only on profit, but has to do with the respect to the natural procedures. And we have in the museum those procedures that help us take that road. Thank you.
So we can still take 3 questions and try to finish on a positive note. But true, right? Positive but true. Good evening. Thank you very much, and congratulations to the organizers and the panel. My name is Kiritsis. I'm an environmentalist. I have taken notes. I will limit what I have to say. I know people are tired. First of all, let me make a comment on renewables. I think that we can't say that fossil fuels and renewables are the same, but the way in which they are integrated into the energy mix is important for the Green Deal to succeed, because what we want is growth for all and not just decarbonification. Something else that came out of today's discussion is the fact that we identify the discussion on climate change with the environmental issues in general. Bearing in mind that the added value, let's say, of climate change based on the fact that we started having this discussion in 1992 is losing interest, it's waning, interest is waning, and we needed a 16-year-old to make people interested in it once again. I know I don't expect an answer, but the question is, it's a rhetorical question. Maybe it's bad for environmental issues not to distinguish these matters, meaning we might have a problem with a toxic landfill site in our area, and it seems out of this discussion that this needs to be linked to climate change, or the problem of air pollution in Athens, because we know that lately we have high levels of air pollution, and I'm not saying that it's not linked to climate change. So the question is, why don't we talk about climate change by itself and not connect it to environmental issues in general? Now, the new political narrative which people need, can it only be climate change, or should we talk about sustainable development or the efficiency of the tools we use for development and human behavior and education? A short comment. The lack of environmental education has had an impact, but the lack of aesthetics, I think this actually has to do with what we feel about education, and it's also a reflection of ourselves, meaning what we see is a reflection of what we do. The gentleman in front in the first row, yes, you have the floor. Please speak. I would like simply to digress and to say that when it comes to solutions, we need to look at two things. We first of all need to see what we want, because I think that the state looks at the financial cost and not the environmental cost so much. So we want wind turbines, and we look at where the performance is higher, that all the wind turbines must be sited there because it's better for wind companies that want to invest there. So, for solar panels, what about solar panels on terraces or roofs? I think this was a good program, but there was no profit for big companies, so it stopped. It was closed down. So we end up destroying beautiful areas. We have a sighting of many industrial wind farms, and this means that a lot of electricity is generated, but by the time they are transported to urban areas, we have severe losses, and half of the installations are not used properly because we only get 50% efficiency, since we have a loss in electricity when we transport the electricity for a long distance. Hello? Can you hear me? I'm here. I would like to ask a question in relation to nuclear energy. I know that it causes many problems, and we heard that it's also an ecological solution. Is this true? Can it be both? Nuclear energy is clean energy in relation to other sources of energy that we've been debating today, but it is a very expensive form of energy, and you have to pay for security. Why? Because there may be accidents. Nuclear energy, well, the decommissioning period is very long. You need around 5 to 6 years to build a factory that has a footprint, then you operate it for 40 years, and then you need 70 years for decommissioning in order for the environmental impact to become zero. So nuclear energy kills people. We know that the European Union wants to stop using nuclear energy. Right now, only 2 nuclear power plants are in development and are outside Europe. They are in Asia, and they're not. The nuclear energy doesn't seem to be the solution. Thank you very much. So first of all, let me thank you. Let me thank you for this dialogue that we have started on the subject. I've heard a lot of things, but I'd like to focus our attention, and I think we're all well-meaning, we all care about the environment. So maybe we should be careful, because this interest that we show may be exploited by various interests. So that they can make a profit, and this will be to the detriment of the environment. So they may invoke the environment in order to make money for economical gain. This is something we need to be careful. We must be careful so that it doesn't happen. Now, climate change, I believe that climate change existed, it exists, and will continue to exist. Now it's more intense than before. I don't know if it's anthropogenic only. I'm trying to find out the answer. I'm still searching. I was here. I've heard a lot of things, but I didn't hear any solutions. I saw some correlations being made with fires in Rafina and the floods and the fires in Australia. I heard all these things, but this correlation is arbitrary, particularly the picture you showed us about Australia. That's virtual. the one with the fires. There was a photograph of Australia and there were fires, but they were not burning at the same time. They were burning at different time periods. So it's misleading. It's very misleading. Well, no objection. We're having a discussion here. It's 9:22. We started at 6:35. All three issues that you touched upon. I think we talked for 15 minutes about these matters. So if out of these 15 minutes you didn't come to any conclusions, so if you came here from the start and you've been sitting here for 3 hours and you took so little out of this discussion, well, maybe there's another problem there. Now, you wanted to say something specific. You wanted to say that this is all you heard. So it's a matter of intention. It depends on how you came here and what intentions you had and what you had in mind. I'm all ears. We're all listening very carefully, and we said that this photograph of Australia is a specific map or graph which was actually used in an incorrect manner. It misinformed others. Why? Because it was used and reproduced as if these fires had been raging at the same time, whereas this shows the different fires that broke out within a month. And an effort was made by a graphic artist to represent on the map how many fires broke out in 1 month and not at the same time. I told you from the start. So where's the misinformation? Where's the propaganda? And I don't understand how you can prohibit someone from showing the fires where they were located. This is what you're saying. Well, people will judge that. Of course it's being judged. But that's what you said. I think we need to be very cautious when we say something. We shouldn't try to terrorize people because when people are scared, they make wrong decisions and people don't think straight when they're scared. And let me continue my train of thought and then you can answer. So there are different interests at play, and we're talking about wind turbines, for example. So if you look a map in Europe and where the wind turbines are being sited, they're in industrial zones. They are near highways. And here in Greece, on the contrary, I don't know what's happening, but there is this, if you like, obsession to place all the wind turbines on the sacred mountains of Greece. And they say, well, there's more wind there, it blows more, the performance is better. But why should we sacrifice our mountains just because the efficiency is 50% higher on the mountaintops? We love Greek nature. We can't industrialize the environment because it's all over the skyline. It's like a palisade of spikes when there are many other solutions. So why not have solar panels on rooftops? That's a good idea. We should subsidize solar panels. So on the contrary, what they are subsidizing is industrial wind farms that are being installed by large companies, and then they sell the kilowatt hour. The feed-in tariff is huge, and the consumers pay very high prices for their electricity. So maybe it's not an environmental issue, it's a financial issue. So those who cite the wind turbines do so to make a profit. Mrs. Koundouri will answer this question.
Well, I see a young person who's interested in all of this and they want to learn more things. But we see that the issues that you have put are matters that are discussed in the network for sustainable solutions. And it is a network that exists in Greece. It has a large youth section, and with great pleasure, it would be very good to have you speak. Well, we've heard a lot of people expose their ideas, but let's talk about tangible figures. No, we're going to talk about specific solutions. If you have any concern with respect to any part, can be analyzed in all detail. So I think that we shouldn't actually be really destroying the sacred mountaintops of Greece. So the fossil fuels are subsidized 4 times globally than the rest. So I would put a question mark to the sources of information that you have, because you have not convinced, and you have to see where you receive that information. I don't understand what. I didn't say that I have information. I said that I expected to hear data here in order to be convinced with respect to the truth, because I hear various things. So this is not the purpose of the dialogues. It's not a matter of convincing you. It's not mean that each and every one has to be convinced. But I think that it would be wrong of us to actually leave here with the same view. I think the issue is to pursue a line of inquiry, and we don't have to agree with each other, and it's not a matter of convincing each other. But we all have to come here, and we can actually draw our conclusions with respect to what are the key conclusions. And I think that is the most important thing. And from there on, we can see what every speaker has put on the table, what are the lines of inquiry, and perhaps the bleak points. And I agree with a lot of the points that you've put forward. And I think that the majority of people also will have to agree with you. But we have to actually say that we do not seek to convince. It's a matter of dialogue. And good evening. Can you speak closer to the microphone? First and foremost, it was a very interesting presentation. This entire discussion that was held was at a very high level indeed. And I'm a colleague. I'm a researcher in the Greek Center for Marine Studies. And I would like to say that in a scientific point of view, we've heard everything. I think it's been conveyed in the best possible manner. Now, what I wanted to say is that if the term climate change does not satisfy some, at least those who are in fact looking at the sea and studying the sea, we're using the term planetary change. So because this has to do with a lot of matters such as biodiversity and also certain other factors that we could not imagine, and has to do with the secondary effects. So these are secondary and tertiary effects of climate change. So we have a change in the various streams and currents, and we see that the Gulf Stream might cool down, and we see that there is in fact knowledge. And we did have the Ice Age in the past, but if you prefer the term planetary change, I think there is a specific time, or it is actually specifically because man has brought about this change, and it's one species that has brought about such a planetary change. So thank you very much. We started with the terms, and we ended with the planetary change. Would you like a very brief round of comments? Well, as you said, that we need to end on an optimistic note. I think that there is optimism, there are solutions. We discussed it. There's a huge debate about which are the solutions, but there are solutions. That's what we have to take home. There is awareness raised amongst the people. We saw how many people actually rallied around this cause about the environment. I think it's very important to see what's going to happen in the US with the elections. That's going to play a great role. Europe might be small, but it can actually sway and affect China, which is huge with 29% of pollution. And we have to be optimistic, and we shouldn't actually lose our impetus. Yes, I'm also optimistic, and I work very closely with the European Commission for the implementation of the Green Deal. And I would like to close by saying that I direct an accelerator that finances innovation for the mitigation of climate change. And we actually do that either with respect to consumption or demand, or supply, sorry. So if you have such solution, if we have innovative groups and scientists, please come forth. We are very interested in seeing what you have to say and what you're doing. I would like to say that a lot of the solutions that we're looking for have an environmental footprint, and I am very sorry when I see forests cut down for wind parks, but I also hate to see forests burnt down because of climate change. So we have to strike a balance. I'm also optimistic because a lot of things that are proposed and heard are in and of themselves correct. So as a society, as a person, I would like to reduce the trips in which I use my car. I'd like to reduce my consumption, and I'd like to live a different way of life and to go back to nature as best as possible. I don't need climate change to do this. I have my own sensitivity, and I'm interested in doing this. And I think every person counts. I think everything's been said. I'd like to say that things are difficult, and because we have a lot of young people, that the only struggles that are lost are those that we don't give. So we need to give the good fight. Thank you. Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Mr. Carabella Gregoriou. And I'd like to thank warmly all of these people who have been attending. On the 26th of February is our next meeting, and we will be in the centre of Athens, and we're going to look at demographic aging in order to see what we're causing to the planet or not. So thank you very much, and let us have a very good evening.